But they have ignored Greenland from a defense standpoint, and they have ignored the Greenlandic native Inuit people. Final point there, if you look in contrast to Alaska natives, there's an Alaska Sovereign Wealth Fund, Shannon, that has over $80 billion in assets benefiting Alaskan natives. If you get a cancer diagnosis in Greenland right now, it's darn near a death sentence.
Donald Trump just posted what sources are calling one of the most humiliating admissions of defeat in his entire presidency. And the dramatic reversal could reveal that public pressure is forcing him to cave on his most aggressive authoritarian tactics. We're not talking about typical political compromise or finding middle ground. We're talking about Trump going from attacking Minnesota's governor as a felon involved in fraud to suddenly claiming they had a very respectful conversation and are on similar wavelengths. From threatening investigations and federal takeover to allegedly saying he'll work cooperatively with state officials. From sending his most aggressive enforcers to create chaos to reportedly suggesting everything will be collaborative going forward. This isn't Trump negotiating. This might be Trump retreating because the backlash to what happened in Minneapolis became so overwhelming that even he recognized continuing the current approach could destroy his political future. And if public resistance can force Trump to back down this dramatically this quickly, it proves that standing up to authoritarian tactics actually works when enough people unite against them. But before we break down how catastrophically Trump's Minnesota strategy might have backfired on him, real quick, you cannot trust mainstream media to explain what it means when a president caves to public pressure after threatening federal takeover of a state. That's why we built Patrick Smith Show to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want analysis that actually connects Trump's retreat to the power of organized resistance, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happened in Minnesota could become a template for stopping Trump's authoritarian overreach in other states. Your subscription actually matters here. Alright, let's get into what Trump's sudden reversal might actually mean. Because this represents a pattern we've seen before, but rarely this dramatically. Trump makes aggressive threats, launches controversial operations, claims unlimited authority. But when resistance becomes strong enough, when political costs become too high, when even his own supporters start turning against him, he allegedly backs down while trying to spin the retreat as victory or cooperation. And the Minnesota situation could be the clearest example yet. Hours after attacking the state and governor, accusing them of massive fraud, threatening investigations and federal intervention, Trump reportedly posted that he had a respectful conversation with Governor Walz and they're working together now. That's not consistency. That might be panic-driven retreat dressed up as diplomatic success. And if the public pressure that forced this reversal was strong enough to make Trump abandon his Minnesota strategy, it suggests similar pressure could work against his authoritarian tactics elsewhere. Let's start by examining exactly what Trump posted and how dramatically it contradicts his previous messaging. Because the whiplash between morning threats and afternoon cooperation claims might reveal just how desperate Trump became to find an exit strategy from the crisis his own policies created. Sources indicate Trump posted that Governor Walz called him requesting to work together regarding Minnesota, that it was allegedly a very good call and they seem to be on similar wavelengths, that Trump would have his border czar contact the governor about criminals in state custody, that Walz reportedly understood this respectfully and was happy about federal cooperation. Think about what that message implies. Trump positioning himself as magnanimous leader who's willing to work with a governor who reached out to him, suggesting mutual understanding and cooperation, claiming Walz was happy about federal involvement. That's friendly diplomatic language. That's describing collegial relationship between federal and state officials. But sources suggest this came just hours after Trump posted something completely different, that he was allegedly sending his border czar to Minnesota because major investigations were ongoing regarding massive welfare fraud, that he accused the state of being responsible for violent organized protests, that he attacked a sitting congresswoman by name, questioning her wealth. That was threatening accusatory language. That was suggesting federal takeover might be necessary because state officials were complicit in fraud, and enabling violence. Make sure you're subscribed to Patrick Smith Show because you can't reconcile those two messages except as retreat. Trump doesn't go from threatening investigations to praising cooperation because new evidence emerged in 6 hours. He goes from threats to praise because the political situation changed so dramatically that continuing threats became more costly than backing down. And what changed was reportedly public outcry reaching levels even Trump couldn't ignore. And there's the specific language Trump allegedly used in his retreat post. That crime is way down in Minnesota. That both he and Walz want to make things better. That they've had tremendous success in other cities. That's claiming credit for improvements while suggesting collaborative future. That's not how you talk about a state you're investigating for massive fraud and enabling violence. That's how you talk when you're looking for face-saving exits from strategies that exploded in your face. But Trump's retreat becomes even more obvious when you examine the specific lies his administration might have been caught telling. Because sources suggest the dishonesty about what happened in Minnesota was so blatant that even Trump's own Justice Department officials reportedly had to distance themselves from claims other administration figures made. And when your own people won't defend the official narrative, that's a sign the lies became unsustainable. Reports indicate administration officials initially claimed a person shot by federal agents was brandishing a weapon and posed imminent threat. But video evidence that emerged allegedly shows something very different. That the person might have been holding a phone to record the incident rather than a weapon. That Border Patrol agents could have removed a holstered firearm from the person rather than the person brandishing it. That the official narrative contradicted what multiple camera angles captured. And sources suggest senior administration figures made even more extreme claims. That they called the person a domestic terrorist who came to massacre law enforcement. That they said the person intended to inflict maximum damage. That language creates specific legal and political justifications for lethal force. But if video evidence shows those claims might be false, if the person was actually exercising constitutional rights to protest and bear arms rather than planning terrorist attacks, the entire official narrative collapses. Think about what happens when lies become that obvious. When a Justice Department official appears on television and reportedly can't defend claims his colleagues made. When he allegedly says nobody thinks those statements were meant to match the legal definition of domestic terrorism despite administration figures using exactly that terminology. That's damage control. That's trying to create distance from statements that video evidence might have exposed as false. Even the lying reportedly extended beyond just the specific incident. Trump allegedly claimed Minnesota had massive welfare fraud totaling over $20 billion that justified federal intervention. But sources suggest fraud prosecutions were actually happening under previous administrations. That Trump's own Justice Department hasn't provided evidence of this alleged massive fraud scheme. That the claim might have been pretext for federal operations rather than legitimate concern about actual criminal conduct. And when administration officials get caught in lies this blatant, when video evidence contradicts official statements, when even friendly media outlets start questioning the narrative, political damage becomes severe. Trump might have calculated that the costs of continuing to defend obvious lies outweighed the costs of backing down and changing strategy. But what really might have forced Trump's retreat wasn't just that he got caught lying. Sources suggest it was the breadth and intensity of political pressure that reportedly built against his Minnesota operations from multiple directions simultaneously. And when pressure comes from Trump's own supporters rather than just usual critics, that creates crisis situations even he can't ignore. Reports indicate the Wall Street Journal editorial board, typically sympathetic to Republican positions, published opinion piece essentially calling for ICE operations in Minneapolis to pause. That mainstream conservative media was allegedly questioning whether tactics had gone too far. When outlets that should be defending Trump start suggesting he needs to change course, that's significant political problem. And there are reports of Trump supporters publicly breaking with him over what happened. Social media posts from people who claim they voted for Trump, saying they can no longer support him after watching federal operations, that they believe in Second Amendment rights that allegedly weren't respected, that they can't justify what they characterize as cruelty and inhumanity. When your own base starts defecting visibly and vocally, political calculations change dramatically. Sources even suggest a leading Republican gubernatorial candidate in Minnesota might have dropped out of the race because he couldn't be associated with what the National Republican Party was doing to the state. If that's accurate, if Trump's tactics are costing Republicans viable candidates in competitive races, the party pressure to change course becomes enormous. Nobody wants to be associated with strategies that might cost them elections. And there's reportedly bipartisan concern building in Congress. Some Republican senators allegedly expressed worry about federal operations and constitutional rights. When Trump can't count on complete party unity, defending his actions, when cracks appear in the Republican wall, he loses crucial protection against accountability. Without that protection, continuing controversial tactics becomes riskier. Think about the cumulative effect of all this pressure converging at once. Conservative media questioning tactics, Trump supporters defecting publicly, Republican candidates dropping out, bipartisan congressional concern emerging, video evidence contradicting official narratives. That combination might create political environment where continuing the Minnesota approach becomes untenable, regardless of Trump's preferences. But Trump's Minnesota retreat reportedly fits into a broader pattern that's becoming increasingly clear. When Trump makes aggressive moves and faces serious resistance, when costs of continuing become too high, he allegedly backs down while trying to spin the retreat as victory or cooperation. And recognizing this pattern could be crucial for understanding how to resist his authoritarian tactics elsewhere. Sources point to the Greenland situation as another recent example. Trump allegedly threatened to invade Greenland or impose crippling tariffs, made aggressive statements suggesting he would use military force if necessary. But when international pushback became strong, when allies made clear such actions would have severe consequences, Trump reportedly backed down, and then claimed he'd made some kind of deal or achieved some victory that observers couldn't actually identify in the outcomes. That's the pattern. Aggressive threats followed by retreat, disguised as diplomatic success. And sources suggest Minnesota might be following exactly the same playbook. Threaten federal takeover and investigations. Send enforcers to create chaos. But when resistance becomes overwhelming, retreat while claiming you were actually working cooperatively all along. Act like the retreat was the plan rather than forced by circumstances. And there's reportedly the Kennedy Center situation following similar dynamics. Trump put his name on the institution and claimed he was saving it from deficits. But when financial records allegedly showed the center was actually running surpluses before he took over, when artists started canceling and the rebrand became associated with failure, Trump went from promoting the takeover to trying to downplay it, from bragging about the Trump Kennedy Center to suddenly being defensive about his involvement. Share this with everyone because understanding this pattern matters for resistance strategy. Trump's tough guy image depends on people believing he never backs down. But if he actually retreats regularly when costs become too high, that image is false. And if the image is false, you don't need to be intimidated by threats. You need to make the political costs of following through higher than the costs of backing down. That's what Minnesota protesters allegedly accomplished. They made continuing operations more expensive politically than retreating. But Trump's retreat becomes even more obvious when you look at how his own administration officials might be contradicting each other. Because sources suggest there's no coherent narrative coming from the White House about what actually happened or what their strategy is. And that kind of chaos usually indicates panic rather than calculated messaging. Reports indicate Trump's Justice Department number 2 allegedly appeared on Fox News and couldn't defend claims other administration officials made, that he had to distance himself from characterizations of events as domestic terrorism, that he called the situation a tragedy rather than defending federal actions as necessary response to threats. When your own officials won't back up the narrative, that's not normal disagreement about details. That might be people recognizing the official story is unsustainable and trying to create plausible deniability before it collapses completely. And sources suggest there were contradictions between what administration officials said initially and what they claimed later. First saying a person brandished a weapon, then video showing that might not be accurate. first calling someone a domestic terrorist there to massacre officers, then saying nobody actually meant that legally, first claiming massive fraud justified federal intervention, then unable to provide evidence of that fraud. Each contradiction might erode credibility further and make continuing the same approach politically impossible. Think about what happens when an administration can't keep its story straight, when different officials give contradictory accounts, when claims get walked back after video evidence emerges. That's not sophisticated communication strategy. That could be a sign of disorganized retreat where people are scrambling to minimize damage rather than confidently defending actions they believe were appropriate. There are reportedly questions about why certain actions were taken, why federal agents were wearing masks making identification difficult, why body camera footage hasn't been released if it would support official claims, why agents might have left scenes before proper evidence preservation. Every unanswered question creates more doubt about whether the administration is being honest about what actually happened and why. But beyond the immediate political costs of backing down in Minnesota, sources suggest this situation could be causing longer-term damage to Trump's brand as a strong leader who never retreats. Because every time he makes aggressive threats and then backs down when resistance emerges, it reinforces that he's actually weak beneath the tough guy performance. And once that perception spreads, it becomes harder to intimidate opponents in future confrontations. Reports indicate Trump's approval ratings on handling the economy have dropped to lowest levels of his entire presidency, that his overall approval might be declining as controversies multiply, that the Minnesota situation specifically could be contributing to sense that his second term is chaotic and out of control rather than strong and effective. When voters see a president making threats, then immediately backing down, that doesn't project strength. That projects confusion and weakness. And there's reportedly damage to Trump's credibility on law enforcement issues specifically. When you claim federal agents are keeping communities safe, but video evidence suggests they might be making situations worse. When you say operations are successful but have to retreat under pressure, voters who initially supported tough enforcement might start questioning whether the approach actually works. If strong enforcement leads to retreat rather than victory, maybe it's not actually strong. Think about how this affects Trump's political future. He allegedly told Republicans that losing the midterms means he gets impeached. But if his own tactics are costing him support, if his retreats make him look weak, if voters increasingly disapprove of how he handles crises, Republicans might lose specifically because of Trump rather than despite him. And if Republicans blame Trump for midterm losses, the party's willingness to protect him from accountability could evaporate quickly. Share this video with everyone you know because sources suggest there might even be concern among Trump's closest advisors about how the Minnesota situation developed. That they reportedly recognize the combination of obvious lies, video contradictions, and forced retreat creates terrible optics. That Trump's insistence on aggressive tactics despite advice to moderate might be making their jobs defending him impossible. When even loyalists can't defend your actions, you've lost control of your own narrative. But perhaps the most important aspect of Trump's Minnesota retreat is what it teaches about resisting authoritarian tactics. Because sources suggest this situation demonstrates that when enough people unite in opposition, when resistance is sustained and visible, when political costs mount high enough, even Trump can be forced to back down. And that's a crucial lesson for anyone concerned about protecting democratic institutions and constitutional rights. Reports indicate the Minneapolis protests were sustained despite federal presence. That community members kept showing up. That they documented what was happening and shared evidence widely. That kind of persistent, visible resistance creates political pressure that can't be ignored. It forces media coverage. It generates congressional inquiries. It makes continuing the same tactics increasingly expensive politically. And sources suggest the key was making costs higher than Trump was willing to pay. Not just moral arguments that he should change course, but actual political damage from his own supporters defecting, from editorial boards questioning tactics, from candidates dropping out, from video evidence contradicting official claims. When defending a position becomes more costly than abandoning it, even stubborn leaders retreat. Think about what this means for resisting Trump in other contexts. You don't need to convince Trump his policies are wrong morally or legally. You need to make the political cost of continuing those policies higher than the costs of backing down. You need sustained visible resistance that generates media coverage and congressional attention. You need to find Trump's actual supporters and give them reasons to defect. You need to document everything and use evidence to contradict official lies. Now, Minnesota might become a template. When other cities face similar federal operations, they can look at what made Trump retreat in Minneapolis and replicate those tactics. Sustained protest, evidence documentation, appeals to constitutional rights that Trump's own supporters theoretically value, creating situations where continuing becomes politically impossible regardless of Trump's preferences. And there's the broader lesson about authoritarian retreat. Sources suggest authoritarians depend on perception of strength. When that perception cracks, when retreats become visible, resistance becomes easier because people stop being intimidated. Trump's Minnesota retreat could encourage resistance elsewhere by proving that standing up to him works when enough people unite. So here's what Trump's dramatic reversal reveals. Hours after threatening Minnesota with investigations for massive fraud and sending enforcers to create chaos, Trump allegedly posted about respectful conversations and cooperative relationships with state officials. His administration might have been caught in blatant lies contradicted by video evidence. Political pressure reportedly mounted from multiple directions, including Trump's own supporters publicly defecting. Even conservative media allegedly questioned whether tactics had gone too far. And Trump apparently had no choice but to retreat, while trying to spin the reversal as diplomatic cooperation rather than forced capitulation. The implications could be enormous for resistance strategy. Trump's tough guy image depends on people believing he never backs down. But if he actually retreats regularly when political costs become high enough, that proves resistance works. That sustained protest, evidence documentation, appeals to Trump supporters' own constitutional principles, and making defensive tactics more expensive than abandoning them can force even Trump to change course. And the Minnesota situation might become a template for how to stop Trump's authoritarian tactics elsewhere. When he threatens federal takeover in other states, when agents operate outside constitutional constraints in other cities, when lies contradict obvious evidence in other contexts. The playbook that allegedly forced retreat in Minnesota could work again. Make costs of continuing higher than costs of backing down through sustained visible resistance that generates political pressure Trump can't ignore. Make sure you're subscribed to Patrick Smith Show, because we're covering every aspect of what this retreat means. Every indication of whether Trump's strategy changes in other locations. Every way that Minnesota resistance tactics could be replicated elsewhere. Every sign that Trump's brand as someone who never backs down is cracking under the weight of repeated retreats when facing serious opposition. This could be proof that authoritarian tactics can be stopped when enough people unite against them. Stay tuned.